Lots of organizations are taking some pretty strong actions to date, but my concern is that they're viewing this as too short-term a problem. So I think it's really important to think about this as a long-term issue. I'll talk some more about that. You got to really strategically think about how you can leverage this down cycle to ensure that you come out of it, really strong across every functional area. And recovery is going to happen different in every market and every segment, but you can certainly be assured that it's going to take a while. So when people talk about what is recovery going to look like, how do you plan for the future? You hear people using words like V-shaped recovery, L-shaped recovery, and I'm an MBA by education, and I'm sure I learned that at some point. But to be honest, man, I really wasn't clear on what L-shaped recovery really meant. But it seems like everybody's throwing these words around and asking me like, "Hey, what do you think? Is it like L or V?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, it's I think it's going to be an L. Oh yeah, L for sure." So I went and did some research, on what these are and provide a taxonomy here for you of the common ones. But I'm really a believer in this last model. It's relatively new, and it's called Y-shaped recovery, and it means there's a really sharp decline, which is exactly what we've seen. But there is certain segments of the market that are going to return quite quickly, and a second set of segments in the market that are sectors in the market that are going to return, much slower, more like an L shape, so a very slow recovery. The first curve is going to take a few months. The second curve is going to take 12, 18, 24 months, right? So that's how I think we're going to see the recovery is some segments, good news, are going to recover really quickly and thrive during this period. Other segments are going to take some time. So who's going to be in the fast sector and who's going to be in the slow sector? Unfortunately, most travel businesses are going to be in the slow part of the Y. So some businesses are going to thrive. So healthcare, pharma, people in IT and tech, online marketplaces, tech companies like Zoom or Google, Alibaba, they're all already thriving during this crisis. They're going to continue to do really well. And they're going to help drive economic growth that's going to trickle down over a longer period of time for these other kind of slower recovering segments like travel, like discretionary retail, et cetera. So I hope those are useful in helping you understand how we're thinking about it. We think many parts of the economy will recover fast. Unfortunately, travel is not one of those. So I've talked with a number of people, listened to people like Douglas Quinby from Arrival Event, talked with people from Booking Holdings and Sabre about their views of the different phases. And we put together MG's view of how we think the recovery is going to happen and describing it over 4 phases. The phase we're in right now is lockdown, which basically means, all the borders are closed, markets are severely restricted. And this is going to last 2 to 4 months. Depending on which market you're in, you're somewhere between 2 weeks to maybe a month into it. But during this period, volume has essentially gone to zero, or maybe you're getting a small amount of volume, but we're looking at market overall at 0 to 5% of what it was this same time last year in most travel sectors. Phase 2 is the restricted phase. This is where travel resumes, but it's severely restricted and primarily domestic. So it's not going to be the case that suddenly everyone just opens all borders, opens all travel, right? It's going to be slowly, where people start to say, okay, to travel in this way is okay. Small groups for business travel, going here. So it'll open slowly. It'll be primarily domestic, and it will be driven by, especially driven by corporate. Corporates will be super eager to get back to work. So if you are in a large domestic market, maybe some good news ahead for you if you're focused on corporate. If you're in a small market where most business travels overseas, Singapore, wow, maybe some more time before the recovery starts for you. The third phase is going to be returning. This restricted phase is going to last 4 to 9 months. It's not a week. Best case scenario, I think this will last around 4 months as people start to learn, governments get comfortable, travelers get comfortable, and companies get comfortable with new ways of traveling and taking care of their people. The third phase is returning. Here, confidence is starting to build in traveling and build in the processes that companies are putting in place, and building in certain countries and governments' ability to control and take care of people coming there. So to the extent that people in Malaysia feel it's safe to go to Indonesia, they will, and if they don't, they won't. So it'll be very selective, and I think it'll also start off very regionally. So people will predominantly look for short trips to regional destinations that they trust, whether it be corporate or leisure. People aren't going to book, a leisure trip with their family off to New York City in 2 months. They're just not. So it's going to start out domestic and then start moving, regionally. Indian travelers, first trip is going to be out to Singapore internationally or out to Thailand, somewhere close they know they can trust. And then the last phase is kind of moving towards recovery. And really, this doesn't mean we get back to previous levels. You can see my volume estimate here is 70 to 90%. What it means is the recovery arc stabilizes. We stopped growing at a faster rate than you normally would have expected, and it's kind of the new normal. So I think it's going to be quite some time before we get back to where we were. And even in 12 to 18 months, I think we can hope to be in the 70 to 90% range. So let me drill down a little bit on a couple of these categories. I won't go through all 4 phases because some of them are a bit far out. But I just wanted to provide some real opportunity assessment for all of you joining the call. The opportunity during the lockdown phase is pretty limited. But there are some companies, including MG, that are finding some business opportunities, particularly in trying to help medical team movements. Logistics companies are having to put a lot more people in place in order to handle it and move those people around. So while they're great at logistics, they're not great at finding housing for the rapidly ramped up manning. Cleaning companies and hygiene companies are suddenly both growing their organizations as well as having to put people in new places. And then all these government NGTOs are also kind of out trying to do what they can to support the effort. So there are some limited opportunities with those organizations, and there will be some winners in this segment during this lockdown phase. The next phase was restricted. This is where some travel begins to happen again, primarily domestic, and really the opportunity in this time is people who are really focused on specific opportunities. So if you are a hotel servicing primarily domestic corporate travelers, you may begin to see quite a good recovery even during the restricted phase. If you are a hotel in Bali servicing Chinese inbound primarily, wow, you're going to have to wait. It's not going to happen during this restricted phase. So I think domestic corporate, domestic leisure in some key destinations, governments are going to need to be traveling aggressively. And I think you'll continue to see a couple other segments that will throw off growth during this phase. So, large domestic markets are really going to have an advantage. Thailand, for example, is a market that doesn't have a huge domestic travel market, either corporate or leisure. So while things start to relax there, I think the growth potential is relatively small. In markets like Indonesia, I think it's can be really meaningful, particularly if you're someone who's focused on corporate travelers, or if you're someone who's relatively close to a major metro. So leisure travelers are going to want to go staycation or going to want to drive to Bogor, somewhere they can reach easily. They don't get on a plane with 200 people. They just get in a car with their family and get there safely. I think these are the major opportunities that I see during that second phase, which is the restricted phase. So that's a quick summary of what do we think a recovery model looks like. And I think the key takeaway is it's going to happen slowly. It's going to happen over a series of phases, and you need to spend some time thinking about each of those and how your organization can identify opportunities within each of those as they develop. One big challenge that I've had as an executive is finding information on what's really happening in each market. Even in Indonesia, where our company's based, it's just really hard to find accurate and complete information about what's going on. So when I was putting this seminar together originally, my slide on what's happening was that first slide, which is, okay, everything's locked down. But I came across some work that Hannah's doing where, she really has gone layers deeper to help travel leaders like us try to understand what's the reality on the ground today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over for the next section to Hannah Pearson from Pear Anderson. Hannah, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. Well, yeah, I mean, like you were saying, I was in the same boat. So I do consulting on Southeast Asian tourism, and it was really hard to come across kind of consolidated information about what was going on with inbound travel, what was going on with outbound travel. So I decided to pull all of that together, and basically I came up with this impact summary slide. So I color coded it to make it really obvious for myself and to make it obvious for people at a glance of what's going on in the region. And I looked at 3 different things. So is this country under lockdown? What are any inbound travel restrictions? What are outbound travel restrictions? And then cases and deaths as well, so you can keep track of that. So lockdown, I mean, there are so many different government definitions of lockdown at the moment, and different ways governments call it. So in Singapore is a circuit breaker right now. Malaysia is a movement control order. You've got enhanced community quarantine. But basically, you need some kind of common definition. So I came up with my own definition of what I would consider a partial lockdown to be. So I would consider that to be if they're closing schools, or maybe advising people to work from home, perhaps closing entertainment places like cinemas or karaoke. And I would consider a lockdown to be when they close all non-essential businesses and restrict movement. And so you can see in my slide, there are only 3 countries right now that I would consider are still on a kind of partial lockdown. So that is Cambodia, Myanmar, and Indonesia. Now, Cambodia and Myanmar, they're partial, but they're almost on the verge, really, of being a lockdown. They're under their new year. They've got their new year this week. So a lot of people are already on public holidays, or offices are closed. And they're encouraging people not to really leave the house. So essentially, it's a lockdown, just not quite there yet. Indonesia, Jakarta is under lockdown, but they're leaving it very open, aren't they, to the rest of the regions to decide whether it's a lockdown or not. So it's kind of in fluidity. And Jokowi had said, I don't think the Indonesian economy can support a full lockdown like they're doing in Malaysia. So then I had a look at what inbound travel restrictions there are. And you can see this is all red right now. So basically, it's pretty much not permitted to travel if you are a foreigner into an ASEAN country. And some outright, like Malaysia, say no foreigners are allowed. And then you get countries like Cambodia who have, they ban visas, and then they demand medical certificates, and you have to have proof that you've tested negative for COVID-19. And all these things are really, really hard to do. So essentially, it's not permitted. Essentially you can't. Looking at outbound travel, it's a bit harder to find this information. Actually, governments don't tend to really publicize you're allowed to travel or not. I mean, some countries you just can't, because there are no flights out, borders are closed. So ergo, you can't travel outbound. Some countries like Singapore have done things like heavily discouraged it. So they have a lot of travel warnings, and they have told their residents, if you ignore these warnings and you travel abroad and you come back and you subsequently come down with coronavirus, we're not going to cover your health insurance. So essentially, you're not allowed to travel outbound. And if you're looking at cases and deaths, well, all countries across ASEAN have cases of coronavirus now. 3 have got, the 3 highest are Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. And Malaysia was leading that for the last couple of weeks, and suddenly last night, Philippines is in first place now. So it's kind of developing in the Philippines, which is interesting because it was actually one of the first countries that went on a lockdown.
And what role do you think testing plays in that?
Oh, yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, you've got countries like Laos, haven't you, and Myanmar that have got 19 cases of 41 cases. Come on, there's bound to be more than that. There's bound to be more in Indonesia, probably even, who were saying for so long that they had 0 cases, and suddenly, it is shot up. So yeah, there's a big role, and you have to take these numbers kind of with a pinch of salt. but I guess they've all we've really got. But right now, you know, they're there, and all the countries are taking it pretty seriously and going on lockdown. Right. So what I thought I would share with you all this afternoon are just some kind of high-level insights into some of the most important markets in Southeast Asia, and pulling out some of the key stats of the damage that has already been done. There are loads of forecasts out there, lots of really scary forecasts, but they're all just that. They're predicted numbers. There's no saying if that's going to come true or not. So, you know, as I had a discussion with Brett yesterday, let's talk about what's actually out there, what are the numbers, what has been inflicted on us already. And this is just a snapshot, actually, of what happened, you know, 3 weeks ago, just to show you how quickly things move. So you can see a bunch of green. There were no outbound travel restrictions in some countries. There were no lockdowns in some countries a few weeks ago. No cases in Myanmar, no cases in Laos. You know how things changed. And even if you're looking at the aviation sector, and this is really tiny, but it's more for the impact, I guess. I tried to look yesterday to figure out which airlines are still actually flying in Southeast Asia.
This is too tiny for any of you older folks like me. Don't worry. We're going to make this complete webinar, the set of slides available for you to download. You can also play back this webinar after and squint in there. But it's a great it's a great visual for, you know, half the airlines in the region no longer operating.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly my point. And the ones that are operating are on really restricted schedules. You know, they're only allowed to go from certain point to point. So I think Vietnam Airlines is one of the ones on there that is still flying, but it is super restricted. It's just between, you know, Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh, or Hanoi to Da Nang, one flight a day. So it's really, really restricted right now. So let's move on to the first country. So looking at Cambodia, and what I've done on all of these slides is I have added what percentage tourism contributes towards the GDP. And I've done that for two reasons. So the first reason is obviously the higher number, the bigger the impact that this is going to have on the economy of the country and everybody else in it. And the second reason is the higher the number, also the quicker the government is going to want to get the tourism economy up and running again to support that economy. So Cambodia is a really high one. Over 1/4 of its GDP is generated from travel and tourism. So some of the kind of key stats that have come out from Cambodia, well, passenger traffic at the 3 international airports has dropped by 35%. So that's a big number. You've got things like they have cancelled celebrations for their Khmer New Year, which is this week, in an effort to, you know, stop people traveling. Ticket sales at Angkor Wat, so I mean, that's a pretty big kind of bellwether for what's going on in the industry, have declined by 30 to 40%. And they've seen a 60% decrease in arrivals since February. And even the State Secretariat of Civil Aviation says there are almost no flights arriving or departing from Siem Reap at the moment. It's really quite in dire straits. The government has rolled out some fiscal measures, specifically for tourism. So they've had a few things, some tax exemptions for the aviation sector. They have exempted some tourism operators from tax, and they're also paying 20% of monthly salary as well, which is going to go some way to support tourism operators, but I'm sure that there's a lot more that needs to be done.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So moving on to Indonesia, and the one kind of big headline that I found so far is they have lost at least $1.5 billion since January. And I'm sure that that number is much bigger nowadays. The interesting thing when you look at their arrivals is that in January, they were actually up. So January, they were up almost 6% on last year, January. And then February, you suddenly see this drop to 28.9%. They haven't released March yet, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be even lower than that. Yeah. So it's just been like a slow decline actually in Indonesia compared to some of the other countries as they slowly, I think perhaps they were very optimistic at the start, going around saying we've got no cases of coronavirus, and then slowly reality hit, right, Brett? I mean, you were in Jakarta, so you probably saw that yourself. Yeah,
we really were optimistic with the start of 2020. So it's, and we like the rest of the world kind of view this as, okay, it's happening everywhere else, but we're okay here. And the domestic market stayed quite strong.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, just like the rest of the planet, it made it to Indonesia as well. And these numbers wouldn't even come close to tell the current story if you were looking at April numbers.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we've seen in the past couple of weeks, there's been news coming out about some of the big OTAs in Indonesia, Traveloka laying off staff, Ticket.com is slashing 90% of its marketing budget. The Hotel Association says occupancy rate is less than 2%. At the minute, they say there's about 1,200 hotels that have been closed, but they expect 150,000 to be affected. So these are big numbers. Indonesia is a big market anyway, like you're saying, but these are going to be big numbers that are affected, basically. 200,000 tourism workers should be signing up for a pre-employment kind of program with benefits. And the government have released a few stimulus to help the market, but I think it still hasn't gone quite far enough. So the initial one was focusing on domestic tourism, which is mainly irrelevant right now because nobody is doing domestic tourism. And later ones are on manufacturing tax breaks and now some credit restructuring for SMEs and some tax incentives. But I get the feeling it's still not far enough, I think, from the industry. It's still not a good enough support.
Who's next? Malaysia.
Yeah, Malaysia, my country where I am at the moment. So their headline number, and it's a pretty small number, so I think there must be bigger numbers hiding somewhere else, is they said 17.6 million USD of hotel cancellations so far. Other big developments here, well, this year was meant to be the Visit Malaysia 2020 year. They were meant to try and attract 30 million arrivals. They've been pushing this campaign for the last 2 years, and mid-March, they just had to give up. They just had to say, sorry, we're cancelling this, we can't go on, which makes sense, but must still be very demoralizing for those tourism officials who are looking forward to this. They haven't released arrival data, but Malaysia airports, who operate majority of the airports except Penang in Malaysia, have released their stats. And they showed in February, PAX movement was down minus 23.4%. Aviation Commission has said 13.6 million seats have been cancelled, and that's about 12% of the total yearly scheduled seats. So that's big. And it's not just inbound, but outbound is, hurting too. Travel agents for outbound, they've got liabilities of almost 120 million USD for tour packages. And they're being squeezed. The customers asking for refunds on one side, the airlines not giving refunds on the other side. So you're seeing hotels closing down, you're seeing travel agents closing down. The government has launched stimulus. Here again, they've done 3 separate ones. The first one, again, was focusing on domestic tourism, tax breaks and vouchers and things, but that's not really relevant anymore. And now the most helpful thing I think that they have done for the tourism industry here is said that they will subsidize up to 1,200 ringgit per employee, which is not very much. It's about $250 or so. But that's not going to go particularly far. So I think we're going to see a lot more agents closing down.
I think governments just like companies in the travel business initially responded as if this was going to be a short-term, 1 or 2 months.
Absolutely.
Through, right? They also weren't thinking about this as a 12 or 18-month problem yet when they were developing these programs. So I expect there's going to have to be, where it's possible, where governments have the capability, there will be additional efforts to try to provide stimulus for growth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. So, you've seen, in Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand as well, I think, initial stimulus is on domestic tourism. And then later on, they realize, actually, we need to stimulate and keep afloat, actually, other people. So it's not really about getting people to spend. It's about maintaining those businesses so that when demand is there, tourists can still travel and they can still receive tourists.
Yep.
So Myanmar, there's not a huge amount of data that I've managed to find coming out of Myanmar. Again, it's one of those countries that thought themselves pretty safe. I think they really had very few travel restrictions until a couple of weeks ago. They have seen about $800,000 worth of travel packages cancelled, 100,000 flight tickets, which are normally issued around for Myanmar New Year, Tingyan, which is this week. or cancelled. They've cancelled celebrations for New Year. And in February, they saw tourists drop 30%. But again, we haven't seen March numbers yet, so I'm sure the number will be a lot lower. In terms of fiscal measures, they've done a little bit. They've launched a fund that SMEs can borrow from. They're allowing repayments to be delayed, but there's still a lot of work there yet that needs to be done for Myanmar. Talking about Philippines. So Philippines arrivals down 41%. And they now, like I said earlier, they have the highest number of cases in Southeast Asia, but weirdly have also been under one of the longest lockdowns too. Again, they had this government initial stimulus of domestic funding, but they're not doing much. Their tourism association has written to them to complain with lots of other measures. They're still kind of waiting and sitting on that to see what will happen. And, you know, it's just like you were saying, Brett, it's about surviving now. And yeah, the Tourism Congress of the Philippines, he said, the objective is just to survive. He said, we're bleeding. We just need to survive right now, basically. The only kind of glimmer of good news.
It's like the travel Hunger Games, man. I mean, this is like real deal.
Absolutely. And the only kind of good news came in yesterday in that Philippine Airlines are going to resume some international and some domestic flights in May. So prior to that, they've been completely not flying. So that's a little bit of good news. We'll see how that really plays out, especially given that they're still under lockdown. So who's going to be able to travel? I'm not sure. Who's going to be able to travel in? I'm not sure either, but perhaps they know something that we don't. And the government is also kind of helping hotels by using about 11,000 rooms for quarantine. So in a way, they're kind of subsidizing the hotel industry a little bit there. Next up, Singapore. I mean, and I think Singapore, everyone, I think in the tourism industry is kind of looking to Singapore going, yeah, Singapore is doing the right kind of thing and they're supporting the industry. And I think Singapore is almost got a different situation to a lot of these other countries, in that they had the highest number of cases outside of China for a long time. So I remember even in February, I traveled to Singapore and I was thinking, should I travel to Singapore? It seems really risky. And there are only about 100 cases there at the time. You know, now that seems kind of unbelievable that I was worried about that then. And you can see in terms of all of the fiscal measures that they've done, the font is so small there because they have done so many different things. Some haven't even had room to fit on the slide, but probably the most important again is this wage subsidy up to 75% of up to a 4,600 Sing dollar salary. They've got budgets for marketing, they've had budgets for aviation, they've got bridging loans, property tax rebates, training courses. They're really doing a lot to support the industry. Again, like Philippines, they're kind of subsidizing the hotel industry again by booking out hotel rooms. And these are not just like 3-star budget hotels. Some of these are 5-star hotels that they're booking out to use as quarantines.
These guys are definitely on it's a long-term problem.
Yes.
That now when they closed Terminal T2 for 18
yes.
months.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, so that one was already planned, but yeah, they brought it forward and actually they're kind of making the most of it because they've said, oh, if we close it now, that might actually bring forward the completion date by a year. So they're kind of taking advantage of coronavirus in a way.
I talked to some hoteliers who are working on renovation, and they were planning to do floor by floor renovation slowly over a few years. And they've suddenly, also just chosen this as the opportunity to, accelerate those efforts. So I think there's great opportunity to try to look for ways to turn the crisis into opportunity. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, and they have to. You look at Singapore Airlines; they've cut 96% of their scheduled flights. That's huge. They're not going to have much traffic going in for the foreseeable future. They're still under lockdown for the rest of this month. So they've got to do something, right? And Thailand. Yeah, well, Thailand and Vietnam, I've still got 2 left. Thailand, they just released their Q1 results last week, down 40%, but they actually broke it down by month. So January, they were up 2.5%. Okay, all right, not bad. February down 43%, March down 76%. Those kind of numbers are just crazy. The tourism revenue down 40% overall. It's going to be a really, really long time before the industry here recovers. One of the associations said up to 15,000 tour operators are at risk of collapse. That could be 300,000 employees if the government doesn't do anything. And again, the tourism industry, I think, doesn't really feel like the government has provided an adequate stimulus yet. The Thai government have done 3 different stimulus packages. They're giving some handouts, they're doing some soft loans, but there isn't a lot that is very specifically aimed at tourism businesses. So there's a lot to go there. And you've even got stories, of anti-foreigner sentiment reported in places like Phuket as well. So it might be hard PR-wise to recover from some of these things too, in a country that's traditionally really seen as very welcoming to foreigners, and suddenly you've got some of these anti-foreigner stories coming around as well. So they've got not only the tourism side, but also the PR side that they're going to have to contend with. But Chinese tour operators, TAT, the authority, the Thai Authority of Tourism Authority of Thailand, whichever way around, were saying earlier that Chinese tour operators are desperate to restart business. So, I think they are focusing on trying to get Thailand as clean and as safe as possible in the hope that they can reopen as soon as possible to the Chinese market. And last but not least, Vietnam, who also released their Q1 stats last week. So they were down 18.1% in Q1, but March they were down 68%. So I think it's definitely January and February that I'm pushing the numbers up there. And you've got other big numbers, 2 of the big travel agencies there, Saigon Tourist and Viet Travel, say their sales are down 80%. Vietnam Airlines won, 500 million USD from the government to be able to support it. They're one of the biggest hit government-owned companies at the minute. But it's quite interesting in Vietnam because their lockdown is meant to finish on Thursday. So we've just had an announcement yesterday that Bamboo Airlines and Vietjet have said that they're going to resume domestic flights this week already. So it will be really interesting to see, A, if the Vietnam government actually lifts the lockdown, and B, who will travel. Are they going to travel, like you said, for leisure? Maybe not, but perhaps for business and traveling around Vietnam.
Yeah, not a market not a market lots of travel executives might follow unless they're doing business there directly. But it's a great market to watch right now. One, for how they're dealing with the situation, a really low cost model for containment, and 2, it looks like a couple of days from now they're going to move forward with opening domestic. So it'll be interesting to watch. Does it happen? And 2, if it does happen, what are travelers' views to resuming domestic travel? Do they jump right in, or does it follow some of the models that we were putting out earlier?
Yeah, exactly. I think they're going to be a really interesting kind of case study on how to or how not to handle this, and maybe we can have a discussion about that in a few weeks' time and see how that's all panned out. Yeah. So I mean, that is really, I think, where we stand in terms of the travel landscape right now. And I know I've thrown out a bunch of facts and figures, and probably your brain is kind of exploding right now. But like Brett said, you could download the slides and look at them. If you've got more updated data that haven't got in there, let me know, because this is a really rapidly moving situation, and there's always more things that I haven't discovered yet. So I'd be happy to find that. And I think that probably leads us pretty nicely to Brett's next section.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So this is just kind of the wrap-up section, which is, I wanted us, again, just to reflect on, as business leaders, thinking about that this is a 12, 18-month or longer issue. So I just think it's really important to visualize as you think about how are you going to structure your company, what resources are you going to need where, what segments are you going to focus on during these phases. It's really important to think about this as a leader with a long-term horizon. And so these 3 lines are just different models we were using internally at MG to market versus 2019. How big is the market overall at the end of 2020? How down is it versus the previous year? And so depending on, whether you're a pessimist or optimist or you're somewhere in the middle, these are, are general trajectories that you can think about for how long it's going to take us to get back to that. Some of the travel companies focused on different sectors may fare a little bit better, more like the optimist model. Others may take that long road that's more in the pessimist model. But it's definitely a long-term change in how we do business. And when things come back, they're just going to be different in so many ways. So it could be that they're different in that you want to take a business trip to Beijing. I just saw an announcement yesterday. The government requires that if you want to check into a Beijing hotel, you need to have a health certificate. 100% of people. So this is, suddenly a new requirement for travel. If you're a corporate travel agency, or maybe you're a hotel targeting corporates, is this something that you're going to have to add into your process? Or many countries will probably quarantine, some of the countries in which you do business. So is it worth, sending your executive from Thailand to Indonesia if he's going to have to spend 2 weeks in quarantine once he arrives, right? It makes a whole new cost in the business. So I think during each phase, there's going to be a lot of different changes in how we travel. Of course, people are going to care more about health, safety, and hygiene as a part of that. So there's definitely going to be opportunities in terms of how you do your business and in terms of which sectors you go and target. So during this down cycle, particularly during lockdown, I think this is your time to go and be strategic, thinking about the next 18 months. And while the market may come back at a slow rate, there will be players who will outperform the market. So you want to be one of those players. You don't want to be someone who lets go of all your salespeople to save costs and I hire them, and when the market comes back, you've got no salespeople, right? So you got to think proactively around what are the opportunities, what are the segments, and you have to come into the recovery phases looking to outperform the market so that you get to even higher levels than you were pre-crisis. And that is the formal part of the presentation. We'll move on to some Q&A. We had a question from Amelia Hannah from Antavaya Jakarta MICE. She's basically looking for ideas around, okay, I want to stimulate, companies to feel confident in traveling. What are some ideas you have around trying to help people that may be the first ones out, banking, healthcare, to encourage them to travel? Maybe I'll throw it to you first, and I'll add in my.
You chose the question. I threw it at me. No, that's fine. It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because it's very much like Brett was saying. I think companies themselves will be weighing up those kind of obligations that they're going to have to fulfill by sending their employees. So like you're saying, if you're going to Beijing hotel, you're going to need a health certificate. Is it worth me then getting all of my employees to have a health certificate to be able to go on this incentive trip to reward them? So I think a lot is going to come out from what restrictions countries are going to impose on inbound travelers. I think probably the easiest one is going to be domestic, but again, in Indonesia, I have a feeling that it's going to take a little while to resolve itself to coronavirus. I think we're just starting to see kind of the beginning of it. So I think it's going to be a little bit of a longer recovery in Indonesia. But I mean, for certain, there are going to be MICE companies. There are going to be companies that are doing very well. So like you said, like healthcare companies, I'm sure are going to do very well out of this. Simply, same with pharmaceutical companies, they're going to be doing well. Companies who are manufacturing the rubber gloves and the PPE, the protective equipment, they're going to be doing well too. So there will definitely be companies that will have the money to spend on travel, but it's just going to be the companies themselves are going to have to balance those requirements from that countries impose and thinking is it worth it to jump through all of these hoops and even potentially have my employees have to be quarantined when they come back to Indonesia to send them? What do you think, Brett?
I love Amelia's question, and I think it's exactly what we were talking about in the last slide, which is how do you find opportunities, and what are they?
Yeah.
So, what I would do, if you have time, which now you have time on your hands, right? I would start trying to define, how do I make this experience something that those corporates are comfortable with? So it's like, I'm going to find a hotel partner who's going to define, next level hygiene standards. It's like any room you stay in has been disinfected since the last guest went there by so-and-so standard. Here's what that property does for every room. Meeting rooms, they do this. So it's like gold standard hotel partner that I'll start marketing to my MICE companies. Maybe they do mobile check-in. So you don't have to touch a card key. You can just use your phone, not check-in, mobile key lock or something, You can use your phone to enter your door. Don't need to touch anything. So I don't know what the standards that you would establish, but I would have a little package, because companies need to start traveling, right? It's like, hey, small groups. We set up the meeting rooms for social distancing. We have these hygiene standards here. So, hey, healthcare company, hey, banking company, if you want to set up meetings, we've got this safety and security package that we can market to you, that we've set up in coordination with these 3 hotels in Jakarta, these 2 hotels in Surabaya, these 5 hotels in Bali. And you can be assured this is what the experience is going to be like. So I think those are the kind of opportunities you can try to go and market. When you pitch it, you'll know if it resonates with those corporates or not. But I would guess things like that would.
Yeah, there's like some good ideas. And then Lucky Huandoko says, is there any data when SARS and Ebola was striking compared to current COVID-19 in terms of how long the rebound has taken? Now, I don't have stats to hand about how long the rebound took from SARS and Ebola. Do you, Brett?
I don't have knowledge of Ebola. I was living in Singapore during SARS. It doesn't feel comparable to me. It was an Asian thing. Somehow seemed to get contained quicker. There was like a few weeks of people, maybe a month, I don't know, maybe 6 weeks. I remember we all freaked out, but it seemed like it was gone quickly. And my experience in living through this just feels like
completely different. Yeah, and I think that's what a lot of people have said, actually. Just from I think also because the China market was impacted initially, and nowadays it has such a huge impact within Southeast Asia, within the world in terms of outbound. There has been much more, travel from China out than there was during the time of SARS. That is just, we can't really compare. And like you said, it's now every, is it every country in the world? Almost every country. And it's probably harder to name the countries that don't have COVID-19 than do. It's hard to pick.
In the SARS period, China wasn't an important inbound market, and now it's #1 inbound market for almost every Southeast Asian country.
Yes. Yeah.
We got a new question from Johannes Chang. I don't know if Demas, you can take us back to the slide on restricted recovery, but Jonas is asking, which market do we think will recover faster? Which country? And also, in Indonesia is going to be leisure or corporate. As I said, on this restricted phase, I think that the recovery is going to be corporate led, because businesses are going to have to get out there to get the wheels turning again. And in that Y-shaped recovery model, it's going to be led by the businesses that are finding huge opportunities in this type of environment. The online marketplaces, healthcare, sanitation, all these types of businesses will be thriving. If you're in discretionary retail, mall stores, you're in trouble, right? So I think it'll be led by corporate. And then which markets recover faster? It's markets with large domestic traffic. So Indonesia is going to fare better than most, because the government's going to feel much more comfortable getting the problem under control and easing off domestically before they are opening themselves to the world. And I doubt countries do. They're going to open themselves selectively. It's like, okay, people from here with this kind of certificate can enter. I also think on the medium long-term horizon, there's a lot of people talking about the ability to test. In addition to just testing if you have it, there's a lot of development on testing for the antibodies. So I think you can fully suspect in the future, both companies before they send someone to travel, and then countries or maybe even hotels will want to know, hey, can you provide proof that you have the antibodies, right?
Yeah.
Some medical certificate that proves, you've already gone through it and are resistant.
Yeah.
That would be safe for us to send you on a business trip.
Yeah, and one market actually that could recover in Indonesia is very much dependent. But if Saudi Arabia opens up again, then the Umrah pilgrimage market and Hajj, that will pick up. I think probably the fastest out of leisure or corporate if they allow Indonesians back in and if they open up and they manage to jump through whatever hoops Saudi Arabia imposes on them. But that potentially could be quite a lucrative market to get back into. But of course, it's very dependent on Saudi Arabia.
Yes. Hannah's actually a specialist in the Muslim travel market. We should schedule a follow-up webinar in the near future talking about this situation's impact on the Muslim traveler. I think that'd be a great webinar.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have the last question because we're running out of time. 4 minutes left in our hour.
Yes.
From Gindo. He wants to know what our take is. I guess this is from a hotel perspective. What do we think about
I think so.
OTA commissions? I'm really interested as I talk to lots of GMs. I mean, I think this is the OTA dilemma is also super important to think about in a macro sense. So OTAs are no longer a channel. They're like for most hotels the dominant channel.
Yeah.
They're also the one that has the biggest commission or lowest discount. I mean, it used to be me, Mr. Wholesaler. We were the kind of the super low price channel, but OTAs have essentially become the volume and low price channel, and wholesalers now are kind of more conduits into corporate, and hotels are looking to yield up. I think that I would encourage Diego you to join the call with Dan Lin. He's one of the biggest thinkers. He used to run Expedia and APAC, and he's going to talk about from a hotelier perspective how should you not use OTAs, and he's very pragmatic and very low to the ground about giving insights. I think that you should try to seek everything you can from the OTAs, but in this early phase of resumption, they're going to be hungry for money as well, and they're going to be one of the channels because they're online. Consumers don't need to go anywhere to use them. They will be in a really great position to capitalize on the return of travel. So I think it's going to be a really important channel, and you're going to have to try to do your best to manage the terms with them. The best option is to have multiple, so no one person controls too much. So you're going to have to use them, and a lot of them in the restricted recovery phase. But don't have just Traveloka or just Ticket or just Booking. You want to have all the OTA traffic you can. And you want to try to split it at even numbers. Don't give anyone too much.
Good advice.
What do you have to add to that, Hannah?
Yeah. I mean, you're the OTA hotel commission expert, I think, more than me. But yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, it always makes sense to spread your OTAs and probably spread the OTAs in terms of source markets as well. Choosing OTAs that are also mainly booked by the Chinese market or Indian market, or spreading in terms of geographically as well as within the different OTAs as well, just to kind of hedge your bets in terms of source market too.
We had one more question come in. I can maybe pass it over to you. They're asking about the psychology of the salesperson after this pandemic. Working from home.
Yeah, I mean, that is an interesting one actually, because a lot of what I do is sales. So I'm also a sales representative for a European tour operator, and I'm very much used to being out on the road, meeting people, and having to do this all over video. Personally, is also a little bit frustrating. Sometimes I think you miss that spontaneity. So it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think that people, on the one hand, kind of appreciate the convenience, and it's very efficient to work from home. You don't have your commute, you just get on the video conference and you get straight to it. But I think you miss that physical. I think a lot of salespeople will miss that physical presence of people and being able to have that spontaneity of thought and conversation that comes up when you're in the same room. And I think a lot of companies after this will want to kind of reunite their staff, whether that is obviously in a kind of social distancing way, but whether that is a retreat or whether that is just a big conference to get everybody together to rally the morale. I think that we're going to see that. People want to be with people. They want to see each other again, not just over a screen. What do you think,
Yep.
Brett?
I think that's right. I think salespeople are going to come out of this with a new set of skills, and they'll use the best of both, the best of what they used to have with lots of in-person, and the best of the new skills they've learned in this work from home remote environment. So I think it's just going to make salespeople stronger. If you're a salesperson, Lei, and wondering, you just got to stay positive, stay strong. Know you're going to come out of this better than you were going into it as a salesperson. Don't get held up in your own house. And I know it's hard as a salesperson to even get people on the line, but you got to keep looking for those opportunities. Sales,
absolutely.
Sales in particular is super important during this period, even though it may seem like it's not.
Yeah, agreed.
Last question, only a yes or no. We have, because we were out of time, but Hannah, you and I give a yes or no to my good friend Jimmy. He's asking about putting aside COVID-19. What do you think about the U.S. trade war? We're off topic, but my opinion would be it's going to be kind of a thing of the past or a back burner issue for quite a while. What's your view?
I think it's going to be a side note for the minute. I think everyone's just focusing on getting through this, surviving, and then they'll think about trade war after that, I think.
All right. Well, thank all of you for your participation. Hannah, thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Great. And we hope to see some of you on Thursday for the webinar about the return of the Chinese traveler. If you don't know Anita Chan, she is phenomenal. You're going to enjoy learning from her. And next week, don't miss a session with Dan Lin on how to and how not to use OTAs during the recovery. Thank you.